Please rewind this cassette.
Game of Thrones Season 8 was a fucking disaster. There's really no other way to put it.
Best season ever!
I was a little bit more forgiving as time went on, especially after I saw the season as a whole. But on really thinking about it and looking back at specific episodes and just how the writing went and how D&D just didn't seem to care in their string of embarrassing inside the episode interviews where they just said one idiotic thing after another.
Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
At that point, Jaime really has to take a really long, uncomfortable look at who he really is.
I never really cared much for them, innocent or otherwise.
And then, you know, she has said repeatedly throughout the show, I will take what is mine with fire and blood.
The blood of my enemies, not the blood of innocents.
Oh my God, they're serious about doing this fucking zombie bear.
In the nicest possible way, fuck you.
It's safe to say that this might be the most disappointing, poorly handled final season of a television show, even more so than shows like Lost or Battlestar Galactica. So let's start at the beginning. We're going to go through the whole season piece by piece, and I'm going to point out specific problems that I had and overarching things that I think were the issues with this season. So let's start with the first episode, which ended up being the best episode of the season, which has never happened on Game of Thrones. I think the premiere's never been the best episode of any season. And I don't think that's a reflection of this episode being great. I think it's more of the fact that things got worse as it went on. From episode 3 on, it was like a roller coaster, except while you're riding the roller coaster, just shit is being flinged at you. Like monkeys are hanging off the edge of the ride throwing shit in your face. So at first you're like, oh, the build-up's real nice. I'm in the part where you're like backed up and you're going over the hill, and then when you go down, there's a monkey there ready to throw shit on your face. And when you get to the end of the roller coaster, you just land in a pile of shit. That's what it felt like watching this season. So the first episode, what I liked about it was that it was contained. There was a lot of reunions. There was a lot of interactions that were things I did want to see, and I think a lot of people wanted to see. And it had a hell of a cliffhanger. The last sting with Bran waiting for Jaime to show up, that he's waiting for an old friend, and the way they look at each other was a very exciting moment. It was a very, like, where's this going to go? And then you saw the preview for episode 2, and there's a trial for Jaime Lannister. So I was excited. I was excited to see Bran and Jaime have an interaction. I wanted to see how Jaime was going to argue for himself when Dany brings up the, like, hey, you killed my father. You've been with the enemy for the majority of the, you know, the run of the show, but your life. You know, there was a lot of things to bring up. There was things that Sansa could have brought up. There was things that Jon could have brought up. And I know that, you know, they just kind of said, hey, it doesn't matter, we have to fight the army of the dead. But if the season really didn't end up being about the army of the dead, that was all one episode. So I can't give that excuse now that I did before. I said, well, you know what, it's fair. I guess they just need to move past this because it's really about the White Walkers. And then it ended up not being about that at all. So cause and effect. So you set up the thing with Jaime Lannister, and then the payoff to this is we get a very quick trial sequence, if you can call it that, where nobody really makes any great points. Brienne comes up and defends Jaime, and then Sansa says it's okay. And then we just kind of drop it. Jaime has a brief conversation with Bran, which is my favorite moment of episode 2. And that's about it. There isn't much with Jaime. That's the end of any kind of conflict. Bran doesn't care. So that payoff, that stinger at the end of the first episode, didn't really go anywhere. And this is an issue with the whole season. A lot of things are set up that don't have a proper payoff. We start to see that Sansa and Daenerys are at odds with each other. For no real reason, Sansa and Arya dislike Dany, and I know a lot of people in my comment section over my video reviews for this season have told me that, what do you mean? She killed all these people, and she's burned a bunch of people, and she's conquered all these places, and her bloodline's bad, so why would they trust her? I'm like, well, I don't know, because she flew up here to fight for them, and she lost one of her dragons in the process last season to save their brother and several other characters, and then she fights with them, and then eventually she loses another dragon. Now, that wasn't necessarily to help the Starks in Winterfell, but if Dany hadn't taken out Cersei in the Golden Company and the army, then you have to assume at some point, once their forces were built up, they would just go take Winterfell. Or honestly, the Army of the Dead would have just killed everyone at Winterfell, including Sansa. And then Sansa says that her argument to Jon at one point,
Arya's the one that killed the Night King.
It's like, well, yeah, she killed the Night King after dragons were blowing fire on them. There was all of these men fighting from Dany's army. And I mean, granted, to go into that episode is just ridiculous, the logistics of Arya killing the Night King and all that. But so this is set up, and the payoff to this is eventually Dany becoming the Mad Queen, and then Sansa being a bit justified in her feelings towards her. Now, this is also rushed, though. None of this is handled with nuance. None of this is paced out well. This is stuff that should have been developed over a couple of seasons, a few episodes worth of material, to where you get to the end where Arya says, you know,
I know a killer when I see one.
And you're sitting there confused going, well, yeah, she just killed thousands of people in King's Landing with her dragon. Of course she's a murderer, and you're a murderer too, as is Jon, as is just about everyone you know. What's with this hypocrisy in Westeros all of a sudden? So that's one thing that just kind of doesn't really go anywhere. I see the seeds were being planted of the conflict between the Stark family and Jon's loyalty being pulled by two sides. But once again, none of these things really are the focus. They're things that are mentioned a few times. How many times has Jon Snow mentioned that Dany's his fucking queen? I mean, it's like every goddamn episode. He's just blindly loyal.
She is my queen. You are my queen. You are my queen. You are my queen.
By the way, Jon Snow, what a dip in character. I mean, don't get me wrong, Jon's always been dumb and always been sort of generic, but he's had highlights. Like, he's the best part of Season 5 in many ways. And I like Jon in Season 6 for the most part. But man, did they just make Jon have... They just gave him nothing to do, really. He didn't do anything major during the battle at Winterfell. He basically just got his ass kicked several times, and we saw him run around. He didn't really get to do very much at the King's Landing fight. And in the last episode, he gets his moment to kill Dany. And that's about it. And then he gets to go to the wall like Grey Worm's like, hey, do you want to go hang out with all of your friends up north and just live the rest of your life happy? Oh, yay, punishment. Even though Grey Worm has an entire army and could kill everybody, and they just killed his queen. Never mind, none of it makes any sense.
And he kind of forgot.
So the first two episodes aren't bad, especially when compared to Season 7, and a lot of the flaws with Season 5 and 6, although in retrospect, Season 5 was much better. So the first two seasons did a fine job of establishing things, but once again, let's talk about things that were set up. A big part of Episode 2 is everybody saying their goodbyes. Everybody's sitting around the table drinking. Everybody's talking to each other afterwards, and Brienne gets knighted. It's the most emotional scene of the season, right? So this is all about, like, this is our final moment together before we die, before we fight death. And a lot of us are going to die. So what happens after that? Well, none of those people die, really. I mean, Jorah Mormont dies, Theon dies, but they really don't do very much in that episode. The characters we spend that time with, Jaime, Brienne, Tyrion, Davos, Podrick, none of those characters die. So it just kind of makes that episode pointless in a lot of ways. It's just there to give you the illusion of this feeling of finality, that things are going to end following this, and then there's no resolution to it. They rather easily, it feels like, at least in retrospect, defeat the army, and then even the soldiers that Dany loses magically pop back up in the later half of the season. Alright, so these first, 3 episodes of Game of Thrones were all over the place. I thought the first episode was fine. The second episode seemed okay at the time, although I thought, why are we wasting so much time when we could be doing important things with the plot and character development? I mean, I don't know. One of the big issues with the last, I'd say, 3 seasons is how much time was wasted on pointless scenes where nobody's talking. there's all these extended shots or sequences where people are just walking around. I don't even think there's like 1/3 of the dialogue that there used to be in the show. The show used to be rich with dialogue and conversations. Just think about Tywin and all the amazing scenes with him in the early seasons of the show. And just think about these last couple of seasons and how many scenes. Just in my head, I can think of a dozen where it's just Tyrion standing around not saying anything. It's Jon walking around, Dany walking around not saying anything. I mean, this is very obvious that Dan and Dave not only didn't have a lot of story to tell, they also didn't have a lot of stuff to write for their characters, stuff to give to the actors. It's just a disaster on several levels. To take a show that was so dialogue-driven and plot-driven and then make it this restrained as I think what they were going for, pulled back, but really what you're doing is just making it have nothing.
And he kind of forgot it.
Doesn't have a tone like it used to have. It doesn't have the atmosphere. It doesn't have the creativity going on in different things. Because it used to be in Game of Thrones, there was the surface level entertainment, then there was the subtext that was going on from scene to scene, and then the dialogue would be filled with nuances and things that you could dig into that meant something. It would tie back to other conversations. It was a beautiful tapestry. It was a poem. It was a riddle. It was all sorts of things. Now it's just a mess, I suppose. But these first few episodes, they kind of tricked you because you thought with the first two, maybe they're getting back into a groove after season 7. And then The Long Night happened. Now, The Long Night is the episode that kicked off me talking about Game of Thrones this year. And it was a very successful video, 200,000 views. And I appreciate everybody who supported that video and that series that came from that. That was the inception of it, just from my anger. I got a lot of criticism on that video. You know, I'll talk about a few of the criticisms. People didn't like how much I attacked Nerd Soup, which I only brought them up twice. People thought that I was a little too much, I don't know, I was angry, I was too aggressive, I didn't have proper tact in my approach to being critical. They always say it's constructive criticism. You know, you could give more constructive criticism, which really most of the time constructive criticism is just somebody's subjective opinion on what they think is constructive. That doesn't mean that it's actually constructive for what the person's doing. And, you know, they just said that I was immature, I was ranting, and, you know, that's probably fair to a point, but I don't think there's anything wrong with me, I don't know, talking trash about YouTubers that I used to like. The biggest misconception with the Nerd Soup thing was that people seem to think I always hated Nerd Soup. But no, I actually really like the show, and I like those guys. I think it's well produced and well done. What disappointed me was just that they were giving these things a pass and coming up with these simplistic, rather fanboyish explanations for things that didn't make sense. You know, no, this episode's brilliant, man. You're just a hater. You don't get it. And I'm not saying they were that way, but the comments reflected that. I remember one comment saying, Nerd Soup's the only legit Game of Thrones channel on YouTube anymore. And they meant by that was that they were the only ones that were being positive, or as people said, being fair. It's not about being fair. And fairness is up to interpretation. I don't give a fuck about what you think fair is. Here's the problem with The Long Night. Essentially, instead of me going into another review of it, because I already did a rant on it, let me just talk about all the criticisms that people have on what I originally said. Here's my problem with you guys. You're not being fair. You're not being fair to me. You're not being fair to the integrity of this show, what little was left. You're not being fair to the books. You're not being fair to George R.R. Martin. And you're not being fair to those of us who have paid for HBO all these years, bought merchandise, bought the DVDs. I don't feel entitled to get the show that I wanted. But this did turn into a Last Jedi thing where people said, well, it sounds like you just wanted the show to do what you wanted it to do. You wanted to write the show. You didn't like what D&D had to do. Well, to a point, but in the sense that I wanted the show to be something good. Not necessarily exactly what I wanted, like a theory or what have you. It's just I wanted it to be good and exciting. When you spend 7 years and going into the season 8, setting up the White Walkers, and then the last 3 or 4 seasons setting up the Night King, and him and Jon having this confrontation that is going to come, and you set up all this just hype around the last season's going to be the living versus the dead, and it's all wrapped up in one fucking episode. One episode. Okay? And the fact that you cut corners to get to the result that you want to get to. And then all of the mystery, all of the things we were asking about the show, like what were the White Walkers up to? What's the connection between the Three-Eyed Raven and the Night King? All of those things that are really interesting just get put off to the side. It doesn't matter. I don't even totally mind Arya Stark killing the Night King. People think that pisses me off. It's like, no, it's just how it was done. She jumps out of nowhere. There's nothing clever about it. It's like a silly, cheesy action moment from a bad B movie. I mean, everything about it. I mean, I won't even go into the cinematography and how defensive so many of the crew members got this season. Like, well, how dare you say that I lit it too dark? Like, well, hey, dude, do your job better. I don't have to give people a pass just because, you know, they're professionals. So called it. Professionals fuck up. You ever seen the movie Jack, directed by Francis Ford Coppola? It doesn't look like The Godfather or Apocalypse Now. I promise. It looks like shit. And, you know, it's like, well, he's a brilliant filmmaker, so of course it's gorgeous. It's like, no, people can make bad stuff even with talent. Yes! And that just goes without saying, but some people can't get this. You know, I'm not saying that, you know, Miguel Sociopath is a bad director because he did a bad job on this episode. I'm just saying he did a bad job on this episode. That doesn't mean I dislike Hard Home now. You know, or Winds of Winter even, he did a really good job on. But The Long Night is just, it just shows that Dan and Dave didn't really have a good plan, and they didn't want to take enough risks. You know, I think they had become too attached to the things that they had decided they were going to do. I think, you know, for the last few years, they had planned that Arya was going to kill the Night King. They knew that Dany was going to go evil. They knew all sorts of things like that, but they didn't want to go their own way. You can go your own way. I think the biggest issue with where Game of Thrones ended up and where it started, you have to go back to the source material. You have to go back to George R.R. Martin. I think when they pitched the show and originally came up with it, and this is going to upset some George R.R. Martin fans, but it has to be said. They came up with this idea a decade ago. And at the time, you know, 5 books. So when you think about it, they're like, okay, we have 5 books worth of material. And George has years to write Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. So by the time we get to season 5, we should probably have another book out. And then we could maybe do 1 season off that book or a couple seasons. And then when A Dream of Spring comes out, we can do that as the last season. Well, I think as they got deeper into the show, they realized that George R.R. Martin wasn't going to finish these books. So then they're like, well, shit, what do we do? And he told them plot points. You know, they knew about Hodor. I think Dany, what happens with her is going to happen in the books. They knew all this stuff, but they didn't want to find their own way to get to those places. So you just get a collection of story beats, but no organic connection to that. If I was Dan and Dave, I would have just went a completely different direction from George R.R. Martin. I wouldn't have done the Hodor thing. I wouldn't have done what happens with Dany. I would have just changed it up. Do your own thing. Even the Battle of the Bastards, stuff like that. It made more sense to go in completely different directions. I mean, why not do more with Stannis, even though you don't know the outcome of his story? Why not do more? Although I believe the actor wanted to leave. Stannis was like my favorite character. I'm still pissed off about how he was handled in season 5. Why not go in different directions is what I'm saying. Why not kill off Jon Snow and keep Jon Snow dead at the end of season 5? You know, now in retrospect, I think keeping Jon Snow dead would have made the show a lot better.
I don't want it.
Even though I like Kit Harington and I like a lot of stuff he did in the last few seasons, I still think it could have kept some of its integrity with that. So you have to blame George R.R. Martin for just not having source material for these guys, and he had 8 years to come up with it. So I have to put some blame on him. Also, why did George R.R. Martin write on the early seasons? He's an executive producer, and then all of a sudden he's not around anymore. This is something we still don't have the answer to. Why is George R.R. Martin not involved with Game of Thrones anymore? He could have written on every season with Dan and Dave. I think he could have at least stayed on writing 1 episode a season like he was before. I think he could have helped them come out with an outline for every season. So any blame I'm going to put on George R.R. Martin, this is without knowing all of the details between what happened with him and Dan and Dave. I just think he should have been involved more as a writer. He wrote some of the best episodes. His dialogue was far superior to them. I think he should have stayed on and written on the show and given them more, or at least come up with things with them. Either he left because they were doing things that he didn't like, or they didn't like him. I'm not really sure what happened. I don't know if there was a fight. This information still hasn't come to light, but something definitely happened between all parties involved. So I get their frustration. You know, they just wanted to adapt these books. They didn't know they were going to have to write so much original material. You know, even when they did write original material, like
Chaos is a ladder.
they still, for the most part, stuck to the books. They had this plot, and they're like, okay, well, we always have this plot to lean on, but we can change things up with some of the characters and some of the situations and conversations. So I have to put that blame on George R.R. Martin, just that he wasn't more involved or took a stronger hand with the show, and thus the quality dropped considerably, and it does reflect poorly on him. Having said that, though, I brought up in a previous video, and I still feel this way. I don't know why Dan and Dave didn't bring on more writers to help balance out some of this stuff. I think they should have had a much larger writing staff. Also, if you don't want to do the show anymore, and you just want to wrap it up in these 8 seasons, originally they just wanted to do 7, then just let someone else take over the show that wants to keep it going for 12, 13 seasons, which is kind of what it needed to be, and that's what George wanted. And some people are like, well, it's their show. They can do what they want. It's like, yes, but it gets to a point when the show's making this much money, it still has so much to do, that if they're tired of it, which is fair, they gave a lot of their life up for the show, then you hand it off to somebody else. That's what you do. That's the responsible thing to do. You don't make it all about your ego. You said, hey, someone else can take the mantle from us and continue the show. So my biggest issue in general with Dan and Dave is that I feel like they became too obsessed with the fame and the power and the prestige. In the same way, George R.R. Martin, I think, really enjoys it now over the last several years. And they didn't have the humility to maybe hand the show off to someone else, or just let other people come in and write episodes and take it in different directions. I mean, they had a lot of time to work on this, and I know that Martin spends years on one of the books, and they didn't have that kind of time. But they seemed to get too concerned with blockbuster special effects and big set pieces in episodes that cost $30 million instead of, I don't know, spending time on people having really engaging conversations and people screwing each other over. I mean, it's like all the stuff with Dorne, they didn't know what they were doing. All the stuff in Braavos, they didn't know what they were doing. That stuff should have been great. And then you ruin characters like Arya and Littlefinger and Varys. Now the actors come out and said he wasn't happy with what happened with Varys. Lena Headey's come out and criticized the ending. Emil Clark has come out and criticized the ending. I mean, the actors weren't even happy with this.
I was pissed.
From across the board, this was a disaster. There was clearly no direction that anybody was happy with. I also don't like how much they leaned on David Nutter, or even Miguel. It's like they thought he was just going to keep giving them hard homes in Battle of the Bastards. But then they weren't giving him scripts that were good enough, and they're like, well, just shoot set pieces and make it all about spectacle. And that's all the Long Night and the Bells had going for it, was some spectacle that we had been wanting over the last few years.
We just got a letter. Wonder who it's from.
Your mother was a dumb whore with a fat ass. Did you know that?
It pisses me off just because I feel like this was a masterpiece at one point. I'd say the first 3.5, 4 seasons even, the show was a masterpiece. And it could have continued to be an overall masterpiece, maybe with some dips in quality here and there, that lasted 10 seasons. And they could have kept introducing new characters and new plot lines and new locations. And the show could have kept evolving and changing up every few years so it didn't get monotonous. But because they picked favorites in the cast, and because they picked favorites when it came to locations or who got dialogue and who didn't get dialogue, and how much they just were obsessed with Kit Harington and Emil Clark and Peter Dinklage, and they just forgot about a lot of their supporting cast.
Kind of forgot it.
A common saying, but not their official motto.
It's just annoying because this show, really, it's just one of those shows they needed to bring in new blood. They needed to keep the show fresh. This isn't like South Park where Trey and Matt do a show a week and it's animated and they can stick to current events. You had a huge foundation to build off of that you could have really done something with. And I think Dan and Dave were exposed these last couple of seasons at guys that it caught up to them. The production, the time management, the writing of this. I think they were in over their heads. I think they became extremely overwhelmed once they had no more source material. And I think they got by on season 6. But then I think these last 2 seasons, they were just walking into a wall every day. Season 8.
Gods, what a stupid...
Season...
What are you doing?
It's empty, Your Grace.
What do you mean it's empty?
There's no more...
Is that what empty means? So get more.
Kind of forgot it.